What would you sacrifice to feel truly connected, to never be alone again? This is the haunting journey of Dr. Noah Valdez, a grieving anthropologist who stumbles into an ancient living ritual beneath a forgotten mission, a place where roots don't just grow in the ground, they grow inside your soul. As Noah struggles to choose between love and survival, he faces a terrifying truth. Sometimes the most monstrous thing isn't what lurks in the dark, it's what we carry inside us. Join me as we descend into a story of grief, rebirth, and the price of being human. I used to believe that there was always a line between the living and the dead, a thin, invisible, yet absolute barrier etched by faith, by science, by every sacred text I ever studied. But the truth is, that line isn't a line at all. It's a fog, and when you get too close, the fog can seep in and swallow you whole. My name is Dr. Noah Valdez. I'm 36 years old, a cultural anthropologist by trade, a wanderer by nature, and until a year ago, a husband to the most radiant woman I have ever known, Isabel. Isabel died on a cold January morning in a hospital room that still haunts my dreams. She was my anchor, the only thing that tethered me to a reality I now realize was always fragile. After she passed, I tried to bury myself in work, papers, lectures, field trips to nowhere, but the ghosts came anyway. They whispered in every empty hallway of my house, in every echo of my steps. I started to believe that if I could understand death, the rituals, the beliefs, the thin veil between worlds, I might find her again, somehow. That's when the invitation came, an email from a foundation I'd only heard about in rumors, offering me a grant to document the hidden rituals of an abandoned Spanish mission in the fog-drenched hills of Northern California. Santa Leticia? Even the name sounded like a prayer half swallowed by time. The email was concise, clinical. We believe your expertise in syncretic death rites and post-colonial religious syncretism makes you the ideal candidate. Santa Leticia remains largely undocumented due to local superstitions. We require a complete anthropological record before restoration begins. I read that line, before restoration begins, over and over. It felt like a deadline for my soul. I packed the few things that still mattered, my worn leather field journal, a set of voice recorders, and Isabel's old rosary beads. Not because I believed they would protect me, God had long since become a distant echo, but because they smelled faintly of her skin, and I needed that. The drive to Santa Leticia took me up a winding road shrouded in morning fog. The oak trees, gnarled like old hands, reached toward the sky as if clawing for salvation. The higher I climbed, the denser the mist became, until the road behind me vanished into a pale oblivion. As I pulled up, the first thing I saw was the bell tower. It loomed above the main chapel, leaning slightly, the bronze bell inside crusted with rust. A single weather-beaten cross perched on top like a silent sentinel. The courtyard was littered with fallen tiles and scraps of paper prayers, their ink long since washed away by rain and time. I stepped out of the car, and the cold hit me like a slap. Standing there waiting was Senor Ruiz, the caretaker. He looked as though he'd been carved from the same stone as the mission walls, thin, stooped, skin the color of old parchment. His eyes were impossibly dark, two wells that seemed to hold secrets no one should bear alone. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he handed me a set of old iron keys on a loop of frayed twine. "This place is not just stone and wood, Dr. Valdez," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp in the fog. "It is a mouth. And sometimes it eats what comes too close." I wanted to laugh it off, but then he leaned in, so close I felt his breath on my ear. "Remember one thing," he whispered. "When the last bell tolls, do not step outside. Do not answer any voices you hear." He pressed a small cracked leather journal into my hand. "The rules," he said simply. Then he turned and disappeared into the mist, his figure dissolving as though he had never existed. I opened the journal. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, ink-faded, corners curling, each line an invocation or a command. Never leave the courtyard after sundown. If you hear the choir from beneath the earth, do not sing along. Do not open the third confessional. If a child offers you a doll, accept it, but bury it under the olive tree. When the bell tolls 13 times, kneel and pray, but do not look outside. I read them all, my heart thudding like a war drum in my chest. My fingers trembled as I turned the last page. At the bottom, scrawled in a frantic hand, it read, "Some rules protect you, some protect it. Learn which is which before it's too late." By the time I looked up, the sun had already begun its slow descent behind the hill. I realized I hadn't even set foot inside the chapel yet. I swung the heavy wooden doors open. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and old incense. Rows of pews stretched into the shadows, and above them, a vaulted ceiling where paint peeled like dead skin. At the far end stood the altar, shrouded in a faded crimson cloth. Candles, melted down to their stubs, surrounded a weathered statue of the Virgin Mary. Her eyes had been scratched away, leaving only smooth hollows that stared blankly into the abyss. I stood there, frozen. For a moment, I thought I heard the echo of a woman's laugh. Soft, lilting, almost musical. Isabel? I turned around so quickly I almost lost my footing, but the nave behind me was empty. I set down my bag and began unpacking my recorder, clicking it on. The red light blinked to life. "Field note 1, I began, my voice echoing against the cold stone. "Santa Leticia mission. Initial impressions. Architecture consistent with 19th century Spanish colonial, heavy Moorish influence. Significant structural decay, yet there's something else. A heaviness, an unspoken presence." I swallowed hard. Local caretaker warned me of rules, of voices and bells, possible evidence of folklore bleeding into lived experience, a collective psychosis perhaps. We'll document further. I clicked the recorder off and took a deep breath, my lungs filling with damp air. A distant sound, a metallic creak, echoed from the back of the church. I shivered and turned slowly, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just the building settling, but my heart knew better. I picked up Isabel's rosary and held it tight. I thought of her laugh, the way she sang in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. I thought of the warmth I hadn't felt in so long, the warmth I might somehow find again here. For the first time in a year, I felt something stir inside me. Not hope exactly, more like the echo of a door opening in a dark hallway. As I climbed the narrow staircase to the small living quarters above the chapel, I caught one last glimpse of the nave below. The fog outside had thickened, curling against the stained glass windows like restless hands. I heard a faint clang far away, the first bell toll. I counted it almost by instinct. 1. I didn't know yet how many more would come, or that each would bring me closer to a choice I would never be able to take back. That night, in the cramped room above the altar, I wrote only one line in my journal before sleep took me. I came to Santa Leticia to document death. I did not know I was coming to meet it. I didn't sleep that night. Even when my body surrendered and my eyes fell shut, my mind kept walking the narrow stone corridors of Santa Leticia, kept tracing each crack in the walls, each whisper in the dark corners. I heard Isabel's voice in my dreams. Sometimes soft, like she was humming our wedding song, sometimes sharp and panicked, calling my name from somewhere I couldn't reach. When I woke up, the first rays of dawn bled through the cracked window like fingers reaching for me. My skin was clammy, my throat dry as ash. I sat up slowly, the old cot creaking beneath me. For a moment, I couldn't tell if the knocking I heard was from inside my head or from the door below. It came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing up the stairwell. I stood and pulled on my jacket. The floor was cold against my bare feet. Each step down the narrow staircase a prayer I didn't know I was saying. At the chapel's threshold stood Senor Ruiz, holding a steaming cup of coffee. His hands shook slightly, as though every drop inside might spill at any moment. "You shouldn't be awake yet," he rasped. His eyes darted around the nave as if expecting something, or someone to appear. "I'm always awake," I replied. He nodded, slowly pushing the cup toward me. "Drink. You'll need your strength." The coffee was thick and bitter, grounding me for a fleeting moment. "What is it that you're so afraid of, Senor Ruiz?" I asked. He stared at me as though the question was so naive it hurt him. "I am not afraid," he said. "I am resigned." Before I could press him further, he slipped a folded piece of parchment into my free hand. It smelled faintly of wax and smoke. "For when you hear the second bell," he said, "read it only then." And like a ghost dissipating at sunrise, he was gone, his shape swallowed by the morning fog outside the chapel doors. I held the parchment in my palm, its edges soft from age. My fingers itched to unfold it, but I forced myself to slip it into my coat pocket. I spent the rest of the morning exploring the grounds. The courtyard was a labyrinth of cracked flagstones, weeds twisting up between them like green veins. Beyond it, rows of olive trees stood crooked and silent, their trunks scarred with deep, dark gashes. An old stone well sat near the far wall. Its opening was sealed with a heavy wooden lid, nailed shut so thoroughly that it looked more like a tomb than a water source. I pressed my ear against it, half expecting to hear running water. Instead, I heard nothing. An absence so complete it felt like a scream swallowed by earth. In one corner of the courtyard, a statue of Saint Letitia herself stood under a collapsing arch. Her face had been weathered into a featureless blur. Her hands, outstretched as if in blessing, were wrapped in rusted wire, crude restraints that looked more like shackles than garlands. I found a small garden beyond the olive grove. A single bench faced an overgrown tangle of thorn bushes. Lying on that bench was a doll, a simple thing made from scraps of linen, its face drawn with shaky black lines. One eye larger than the other, its mouth stitched into a crooked, eternal smile. I remembered one of the rules from the caretaker's journal. If a child offers you a doll, accept it, but bury it beneath the olive tree. But there was no child here, no laughter, no quick feet darting between shadows, only me and this doll, lying still as a corpse. I picked it up anyway. It felt heavier than it should, the linen damp with morning dew or something else. A faint, coppery scent clung to it. I tucked it under my arm and carried it back to the courtyard. There, beneath the gnarled olive tree closest to the chapel door, I dug with my bare hands. The earth was cold and reluctant to open. As I pushed the last clump of dirt back over the doll, I felt a sudden tremor pass through the ground beneath me. It was so subtle that I thought I imagined it. I stood, brushing the soil from my fingers, my breath sharp in my lungs. That was when I saw it. The confessional doors, at the far end of the nave, slightly ajar. There were 3 confessionals in a row. The first 2 were open, empty, their curtains torn and rotting. The third one, the one I was warned never to open, gaped just enough to reveal darkness deeper than anything I had ever seen. A thin, sour smell drifted out, like rotting flowers left too long in a vase. I approached it as though pulled by an invisible thread. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I stood before it, I saw scratch marks on the inside of the door, long, desperate gouges that spiraled downward like a whirlpool. A voice rose from inside, low, almost a growl, yet unmistakably human. "Confess, Dr. Valdez." My throat closed up. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed planted, rooted like the olive tree. "Confess your desire," the voice continued, softer now, almost tender. "You want her back. You want to touch her face, feel her warmth, hear her laugh again." My hands trembled at my sides. The air felt thick as mud, pushing against my chest. "You don't know me," I managed to whisper. The voice chuckled, a wet, gurgling sound that made bile rise in my throat. "But I do. You brought her with you. The beads, her scent, her memory." I looked down at the rosary beads hanging from my pocket. My fingers brushed over them, and for a moment I thought I felt Isabel's pulse there, alive beneath my touch. I stumbled backward, breaking whatever spell had anchored me. The confessional door creaked slightly, as though straining to open wider. I ran from it, my breath ragged, heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack open my ribs. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the chapel windows like pale, bloated faces trying to peer inside. A dull clang echoed across the courtyard. The second bell. My hand flew to the parchment Ruiz had given me. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. In smeared ink it read, "The second bell is the invitation. The third is the decision. Do not answer either. Seal the doors. Hide your heart." I looked up at the confessional. The door was now wide open, yawning like a mouth waiting to devour me. From the darkness inside, a shape began to move, slow, deliberate, unfolding as if it had been waiting centuries just to stand again. I backed away, choking on my own breath, my fingers crushing the parchment. Somewhere beyond the trees, I thought I heard Isabel's laugh again, clearer this time, closer, and for a moment, I almost ran toward it. Almost. I don't remember making the decision to run. My legs just moved, carrying me away from that confessional as though my body had decided for me that my mind was too slow, too soft. The sound of my footsteps on the chapel floor echoed like gunshots in an empty canyon. I stumbled past the rows of rotting pews, each one a silent witness to my unraveling. Behind me, the shape continued to rise from the darkness, unfolding like a grotesque flower. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I crashed through the chapel doors into the courtyard, the cold morning air slapping me across the face like a rebuke. The fog had thickened, so dense now it felt like a living thing, wrapping around me, tugging at my clothes, my hair, my sanity. I doubled over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My pulse thudded in my ears like war drums. Every exhale came out in ragged, desperate gasps. Somewhere beyond the olive grove, I heard the unmistakable sound of bells, 3 sharp metallic notes. The third bell. The parchment Ruiz gave me crumpled in my pocket, its warning echoing in my head. The third is the decision. Do not answer. But I could hear her. Isabel's voice, drifting through the fog like a melody I thought I had forgotten. "Noah, Quergido, please, help me." I clutched at my chest, feeling the rosary beads beneath my coat. My mind fought to hold on to logic, to the reality I knew, but grief is a sharp thing. It slices through reason like a blade. I took a step toward the olive trees. "Noah," her voice again, closer, pleading. I felt the heat of her breath in the fog as if she stood inches from me. "I'm so cold. Come find me." I pressed my palms against my ears, shaking my head violently. My knees buckled and I fell into the dirt. My fingers dug into the earth, clawing for something, anything to anchor me. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, swinging wildly, my fist connected with empty air. But then I saw her. Elena Vargas stood there, her eyes wide and wild, her black hair matted against her forehead. "Dr. Valdez," she hissed, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Get up. You need to come inside, now." She pulled at me with surprising strength for someone so slight. My body obeyed, stumbling forward. We reached the chapel doors just as another sound rolled over us, a low, guttural chant. A chorus, rising and falling like 100 voices humming beneath the earth. Elena dragged me inside, slamming the heavy wooden doors behind us. She bolted them shut, her fingers moving with practiced speed. She turned to me, her chest heaving. "Why did you open it?" she demanded. I didn't," I stammered, my mouth full of dust and panic. "You did," she snapped. "The third confessional. You let it breathe." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "It? What is it?" She moved closer, her face inches from mine. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, and for the first time I noticed the faint lines crawling up her neck, tiny root-like veins pulsing just beneath her skin. "It is what the Tuvien was built to contain," she said. "La raíz, the root, the hunger beneath us." Her breath smelled like ash and earth. "Santa Leticia was never about salvation," she continued. "It was a cage, a vessel. The monks were the first roots, extensions of it. Each generation fed it, kept it dreaming. You were supposed to document, not awaken. I stumbled backward, my spine colliding with a pillar. This can't be real, I whispered. This is some collective delusion, some hysteria. She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the chapel. You still think this is about belief? You think this is folklore? She lunged forward, grabbing my wrist, forcing my hand open. She pressed her fingers against the rosary beads. You brought this as your anchor, she hissed, but she is not in there. Isabel is gone. What you hear, what you think is her. That is La Raíz speaking. It knows your grief. It speaks in her voice because it knows that's how to pull you under. Tears blurred my vision. No, I choked. You're lying. She released me, stepping back, her expression twisted in a mix of pity and rage. Il is not here, Noah. You need to understand that before it's too late. A shudder passed through the floor beneath us. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the mission itself were breathing. A soft scraping sound rose from the confessional, slow, methodical, like nails dragging across wood. Elena's eyes darted to the confessional. It's awake, she whispered. We don't have much time. She turned and ran toward the altar, motioning for me to follow. Behind the altar, she pushed aside the faded crimson cloth, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. Go, she ordered. I hesitated, looking back at the confessional. From the darkness inside, two pale hands had emerged, their fingers impossibly long, curling over the threshold like the legs of a spider. The voice called again, softer now. Noah, querido. I'm waiting. Come to me. My feet refused to move. My heart thundered in my chest, torn between grief and terror. Elena rushed up, grabbed my face between her hands. Listen to me, she yelled. That is not her. That is not your Isabel. You are not saving her, you are feeding it. A single tear slipped down my cheek. Please, I whispered, and she shook her head slowly. Please live, she said. Then she shoved me down the stairs with all her strength. I tumbled into the darkness, my knees and elbows smashing against the rough stone. I landed hard at the bottom, gasping for breath. Above, I heard Elena chanting in a language I didn't recognize, words sharp and jagged like broken glass. Then, a sound like 1,000 nails tearing through wood. A scream, high and animalistic, echoed down the staircase. I scrambled to my feet, pressing myself against the cold wall, my entire body trembling. The chanting stopped abruptly. Silence swallowed the air. Then, a wet, slithering noise coming closer. I forced my legs to move, stumbling forward into the narrow passage ahead. I had no idea where I was going, only that every instinct in me screamed to keep moving, to get as far away from the staircase as possible. My hand brushed against something on the wall, an old iron lantern. I fumbled with the flint inside, my fingers numb, my breath hitching with each spark. Finally, a small flame bloomed, flickering weakly. In its glow, I saw markings on the walls, drawings of twisted roots coiling around human figures, merging with them, consuming them. Each face was identical to the next, blank, screaming, and yet somehow serene. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The flame sputtered. Behind me, I heard a soft voice, so close I felt its warmth against my ear. You were supposed to choose, Noah. You were supposed to join us. Tied. I turned, the lantern trembling in my hands, and for the first time I saw its true face. It stood no more than 3 feet from me, framed in the weak lantern light. Its body was human, or at least it had started that way. Pieces of flesh clung like wet paper to a latticework of twisting roots and sinew. Parts of its torso looked hollowed out, dark cavities that breathed in and out with a sickening rhythm, but it was its face that shattered me. At first glance, it was Isabel, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her soft brown eyes shimmering in the flickering light. For one impossible heartbeat, I felt a rush of warmth flood my chest, a surge of hope so sharp it hurt. Noah, she whispered, her voice exactly as I remembered it on lazy Sunday mornings when the world felt safe and small. "Querido, you found me." I staggered forward, reaching out. The lantern slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor, extinguishing in an instant. Darkness swallowed us. But I could still see her. Somehow, impossibly, her form glowed faintly in the dark, a bioluminescent halo that highlighted the ruin beneath the illusion. Her smile widened, too far, her cheeks splitting as if her skin were no more than thin parchment. Dark tendrils slithered from the corners of her mouth, curdling and twitching in the stale air. I froze mid-step, my mind clawing at reality, at any shred of logic. She tilted her head, her voice slipping into a deeper register, inhuman and echoing. You love her so much, Noah. You carried her in your bones and every breath. You would do anything to see her again." My throat seized, words lost behind a rising tide of bile and grief. "Please," I croaked. "Please give her back." The creature stepped closer. I could hear the wet squelch of its roots scraping the stone floor. "I can give you forever," it purred. "All you have to do is let me in. Just one moment, one heartbeat, and you'll never be alone again." I fell to my knees. My fingers dug into the cold dirt floor, nails cracking, blood mixing with centuries of dust. Isabel's face shifted again. Now she was smiling the way she did on our wedding day. Sunlight catching the sweat on her forehead as she swayed to music only we could hear. My mind fractured along the edges. "Take my hand, Noah," she said softly. "Come back to me. You don't have to grieve anymore. We can be whole again. Let me inside." I lifted my hand halfway. My chest felt like it was splitting open. In that moment, I thought of the last night in the hospital. Isabel's final words to me were not about forever, not about refusing to let go. She had whispered, "Live, mi amor, live for me." I hesitated, my hand trembled, hovering between surrender and survival. The creature paused, its smile faltering for the first time. Behind the illusion, I saw it all. The writhing mass of roots, the empty sockets of its true eyes, the countless souls squirming like trapped insects inside its gnarled body. I saw the monks, the caretakers, the ancestors, all folded into one endless devouring consciousness, all echoes in the same horrific quiet. And I realized this wasn't Isabel, it was a parasitic echo, a hollow mimicry fed by my memories. I jerked my hand back. "No," I whispered, each word burning my tongue. "You are not her." A shriek tore through the corridor, so loud I felt it in my bones. The illusion shattered. The face melted away, revealing a pit of twisted roots writhing like snakes in a pit of oil. The creature lunged at me. I scrambled backwards, slamming into the cold stone wall. My fingers clawed for anything, a rock, a shard of lantern glass. My hand closed around a sharp fragment. As it lunged again, I swung wildly. The shard sliced across one of its tendrils. A dark, viscous fluid splattered against my face, stinging like acid. It screamed again, the sound echoing off the walls in an endless, inhuman loop. I forced myself to my feet, pushing past the creature as it writhed and convulsed. I sprinted deeper into the tunnel, darkness swallowing me whole. I don't know how long I ran. My breath rattled in my chest, each inhale like knives. My legs screamed for rest, but I kept moving. Finally, I stumbled into a small chamber. The walls here were covered in crude carvings, symbols I recognized from the caretaker's journal. Roots, eyes, open mouths. At the center, a stone pedestal supported a blackened book. Its cover scorched and curling. I approached it, each step heavier than the last. My trembling hands flipped it open. Inside were instructions, ritual diagrams, prayers written in a blend of Spanish, Latin, and something older, something that made my head throb just to read. It spoke of a final seal, a sacrifice that could force Loreas back into slumber, but it demanded a living vessel, a neo del alma. I felt my heart sink as the realization washed over me. Elena had known. Ruiz had known. That's why they brought me here. A tremor rattled the chamber. From the corridor behind me, I heard the creature's scraping advance. I traced a shaking finger down the page. The words shimmered, shifting, as if alive. I could hear Elena's voice in my head now, distant but clear. Some rules protect you, but some protect it. You must choose which you obey. I slammed the book shut, the echo booming through the chamber. My mind raced, spinning between terror and resolve. I looked down at the rosary beads in my pocket, Isabel's beads. If I stayed, if I finished the ritual, I could trap it again, but at the cost of myself. I would become the new root, the anchor holding the creature down in its prison. I thought of Isabel's last words again. Live. But what is living, if it means abandoning everyone else to this nightmare? Another tremor. Closer now. The creature was almost upon me. I pressed the beads to my lips one last time. I'm sorry, mi amor, I whispered. Forgive me. I opened the book again and began to recite the words. Each syllable burned like fire in my throat. The ground beneath me buckled. The walls shook. Roots erupted from cracks in the floor. A final scream rose from the corridor, impossibly loud, as if the entire earth had found its voice to curse me. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, and continued to chant. The darkness consumed me. The words tore at my throat as I forced them out, each syllable vibrating in my skull like a swarm of hornets. The book trembled in my hands, its pages rippling as if caught in some invisible wind. My knees buckled under me, the cold stone biting into my skin as I collapsed to the floor. I felt it. La Raíz. Its tendrils slamming against the walls of the chamber, slithering and coiling around the archway like black vines. The ground split open, thin cracks snaking across the floor beneath me, oozing that same viscous black sap that stank of rot and ancient earth. The creature's voice echoed down the corridor, layered and grotesque, as if 1,000 Isabels were screaming and whispering in unison. Noah! Querido, stop. Please, stop. I pressed the rosary beads to my lips again, my tears mixing with blood from where my lips had split open. Forgive me, I whispered. Forgive me for not being strong enough to let you go sooner. The chamber exploded in a blast of cold, fetid wind, knocking me flat. I slid across the floor, slamming into the pedestal. My back arched, every nerve on fire as I felt something deep inside me start to unravel, like threads being pulled one by one. I forced my gaze upward. The creature filled the corridor now. Its roots curled like skeletal fingers around the entrance, its central mass pulsing and twitching as if breathing in agony. From its twisted form, shapes began to peel off. Faces, hundreds of them. Some looked serene, eyes closed in a false peace. Others were twisted in screams, mouths stretched impossibly wide. They all shimmered in and out of focus, merging into one another, a shifting tapestry of devoured souls. I saw monks in brown habits, caretakers, villagers, men, women, even children. Their eyes met mine, pleading and empty all at once. And then I saw her, Isabel. Her face floated forward, framed by a veil of writhing roots. Her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming my name again and again. Noah, please, please help me. I almost broke. Every bone in my body screamed to run to her, to tear her free from that living nightmare. But deep down I knew she wasn't there. Not really, not anymore. The creature screamed, its sound splintering the very air. Cracks spread across the ceiling like a spider web, dust and small stones raining down. The book beneath my hand began to glow, its ink seeping out and rising into the air in dark, dancing wisps. I kept chanting, my voice now nothing but a broken croak. A new presence wrapped around my spine, crawling into my chest, my mind, my marrow. I felt my heart slow, my memories unraveled before my eyes, each scene playing out in a rapid, flickering montage. Isabel's laugh at our wedding, the way she curled into me during storms, her final breath. Live, mi amor, live! The creature surged forward, its many faces wailing. Roots burst into the chamber, wrapping around my arms and legs, lifting me into the air like a puppet. I felt my bones grind, ribs cracking, blood filling my mouth. My vision went white at the edges, and somewhere inside that blinding pain, I heard a single quiet voice. Finish it. I drew one last ragged breath and forced out the final words from the ritual. The roots recoiled violently, screaming, tearing at the ground and the walls. The faces dissolved one by one into a black mist that shrieked and howled as it was sucked back into the core of the creature. The chamber shook so violently that it felt like the entire hillside might collapse. I crashed to the floor, my head bouncing against the stone. My limbs convulsed as electricity shot through me, and my lungs seized, refusing to draw in air as my vision darkened. I saw a single tendril snake across the floor toward me. It wrapped gently, almost lovingly, around my wrist. "You are mine now," it whispered, deep and echoing from everywhere and nowhere. And then, silence. When I came to, I was lying on my side, surrounded by rubble. My breath came in short, wheezing gasps. I tried to push myself up, but found that my limbs barely responded. It felt like I was moving through thick mud. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, the rosary beads. I closed my fist around them, pulling them to my chest. Above me, the ceiling had partially collapsed, revealing a slice of the dawn sky, pale and indifferent. A thin beam of light cut across my face, stinging my eyes. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of the final bell, a single, deep toll that rattled in my bones like an earthquake. I realized then that the chamber had transformed. The once damp, root-ridden walls were now sealed tight with solid stone, the passage behind me completely buried. The creature was contained again, but at what cost? I pulled my hand to my chest and felt something alien there, like a heartbeat, but not mine, a rhythm too slow, too ancient. I understood. I was the new seal, the new Neodeolama, the living root. My body might still breathe for now, but I was no longer fully myself. I could feel pieces of my mind being siphoned away, stored like relics in a cold, endless archive beneath the earth. I pressed my forehead against the floor, tears leaking from my eyes. Isabel's voice returned, but softer now, like an echo from a dream. "Live, mi amour." And I realized this was living, in a way. Living not for myself, but to protect every soul that would come after me. I forced myself to crawl toward the book, my fingers shaking. In the margin of its final page, I scrawled a note with the last strength I had. "If you find this, know that I chose to hold it back. Some rules are to protect you, some are to feed it. Learn the difference. And when the bell tolls, never answer." I dropped the pen. My breath hitched once, twice. I looked up at the beam of morning light, my final thread to the surface world. A strange calm washed over me. Maybe this was the way I was always meant to go, not running from death, but holding it back for as long as I could. And in that fading moment, I thought I saw her, standing in the light above me. Isabel, smiling, radiant, free of roots and darkness. I wanted to call her name, but no sound came. My world narrowed to that last image, her hand outstretched, waiting. Then everything went dark. I don't know how much time passed after I blacked out. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No chanting, no scraping roots, no whispers echoing in the dark. Just a heavy, almost suffocating stillness that felt like the entire earth was holding its breath. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy as stone. My skin felt tight, like it had been wrapped too tightly in damp cloth. Every joint ached. Each small twitch sent tiny shockwaves of pain up my spine. I looked down and realized why. My veins, once blue and human, were now threaded with something black and sinuous. Fine hairline roots that pulsed beneath the surface, crawling slowly with each beat of my heart. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a dry, ragged croak. Through the crack above, daylight poured in. It had shifted since I last saw it. The light was stronger, clearer. Morning had fully broken. I wasn't alone. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, I heard footsteps crunching over loose rubble. A faint beam of flashlight danced along the far wall of the collapsed chamber. A voice called out, muffled, echoing. "Dr. Valdez? Anyone down there?" I tried to answer, but no words formed. I felt my mouth move, my throat contract, but no sound reached the surface. The light moved closer. Then, a figure emerged from the broken passageway. Someone in a heavy utility jacket, dust mask hanging around his neck. His eyes were wide, darting over the broken stones and tangled roots. When he saw me, he froze. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "We've got a live one." He scrambled forward, dropping to his knees beside me. He fumbled for his radio, voice shaking as he spoke into it. "We found a survivor. Repeat, we have a survivor in the lower chamber of Santa Leticia. He's alive, but God, he's in bad shape. We need extraction gear and a med team right now." As he leaned closer, I saw his badge. Cal Arch, California Archaeological Preservation Unit. He looked down at me, eyes softening. "Hang in there, buddy," he said, reaching out. "We're gonna get you out of here." His hand hovered over my arm, hesitant when he saw the black veins twisting under my skin. He swallowed hard, his fingers trembling before finally gripping my wrist. When he touched me, I felt a jolt, like a surge of static, a ripple of cold passing into him. His eyes widened. For a brief moment, I saw flashes in his mind. A wife waiting at home, a little girl with missing front teeth, a backyard birthday party. I wanted to scream, to warn him, but my mouth refused to obey. His hand recoiled. He stumbled backward, staring at me in horror. "What the hell?" he murmured, rubbing his wrist like it had been burned. Behind him, more lights approached. Another figure climbed through the rubble, then another, and another. A woman in a reflective vest pulled a respirator mask off her face, her expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. "Is he responsive?" she called. The first man shook his head. He's conscious, but I think he's in shock. There's something wrong with his veins, like they're—" He didn't finish the sentence. She moved closer, kneeling beside me. Her hand hovered over my forehead but didn't touch. "We need to stabilize him," she said sharply. "Get the stretcher down here now." Two more workers rushed forward, unrolling a collapsible stretcher and setting up ropes. As they worked, my eyes drifted past them, up toward the crack of sky above. I could still see the morning light, but it felt different now, distant, unreachable. I realized then that I was no longer just Noah Valdez. A piece of me, maybe the last true piece, whispered to run, to fight, to find Isabel's voice one more time. But that piece was fading, like a radio station slipping into static. I felt the roots inside me shift, coiling tighter around my spine, pressing against my lungs. Each breath felt like it was no longer mine to control. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I saw the book, the one I had used to complete the ritual, lying open on the floor, its pages now blackened, curling inward as if burned from within. One of the workers reached for it. "No!" I wanted to shout. "Don't touch it!" But no words came. His fingers grazed the cover and he jerked back with a startled yelp. He stared at his fingertips, dark sap seeping from tiny cuts. "Don't," the woman snapped. "Leave it. We'll document it later. Move him, now." They hoisted the stretcher, navigating the narrow passage back toward the surface. The air grew colder as we climbed, the roots receding into the walls, pulling back like retreating soldiers. As the first rays of open sky hit my face, I felt a sudden surge of something deep and primal. A hunger, a longing. I gasped. The woman beside me leaned in. "It's okay," she whispered, mistaking my reaction for fear. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." But I wasn't okay, and I wasn't safe. I felt the new heartbeat thudding inside me, a slow, ancient rhythm that drowned out my own. When they carried me out onto the courtyard, I saw the broken statue of Saint Leticia, her head now completely missing. The bell tower above groaned in the wind, the cracked bronze bell shifting slightly, and for the first time, I realized what it meant to be the vessel. Not just a seal, but a seed. As they loaded me into an ambulance, I caught a glimpse of the archaeologist who had first found me. His eyes met mine for a moment, and in that split second, I felt something pass between us. A thin root of thought, a whisper of hunger. He flinched, his pupils dilating, and he stumbled away, clutching his chest. The doors slammed shut, the siren wailed to life, and the world outside blurred as we sped away. Inside, I stared at the ceiling, the white lights flickering above me. I tried to hold on to one final image. Isabel standing at our kitchen counter, her hair tied up, humming off-key as she chopped vegetables. I mouthed her name one last time, though no sound escaped. Then I felt the darkness surge forward inside me, swift, eager, and just before I blacked out again, I understood what I had become. Not a savior, not a scholar, a harbinger. When I woke again, it wasn't to the smell of incense or damp stone. It was the sterile, suffocating scent of disinfectant and plastic tubing. A bright, humming light overhead made my eyes water as I struggled to focus. I was strapped to a hospital bed, my wrists bound lightly but firmly by white medical restraints. Tubes and wires sprouted from my arms like synthetic veins, some feeding into machines that beeped and blinked rhythmically. For a brief moment, I dared to hope I had escaped, that I had survived Santa Leticia and its monstrous secret. But then I looked down. My veins were still black, crisscrossing my arms and chest in an intricate lattice of corruption. They pulsed subtly, moving as though they had their own pulse, a slow, ancient rhythm not at all human. A low groan rumbled from my throat. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Her eyes widened when she saw I was awake. She dropped the clipboard and bolted, yelling down the hallway for a doctor. I turned my head slowly, and my gaze fell on a small window. Beyond the glass, I could see the tops of pine trees swaying in the morning breeze. Freedom, but I knew better. I knew I wasn't free. Moments later, a man entered the room, his white coat crisp and pressed, a stethoscope bouncing lightly against his chest. His expression was careful, somewhere between clinical curiosity and deep-seated dread. "Dr. Valdez," he said cautiously, as though my name might explode if said too loudly. "Can you hear me?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a thin rasp, more like a hiss than a word. He took a step closer, raising a trembling hand as if to steady himself. "We weren't sure you would wake up," he continued. "When the rescue team brought you in, you were unresponsive, but your vitals were—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "They were unusual," he finally finished, as though that word could contain the horror crawling beneath my skin. He flipped open a file, eyes scanning pages he seemed hesitant to believe. "The black vascular changes. They don't match any known pathology. We've sent samples to multiple labs. We don't have answers yet." I saw it then. Behind his professional mask, the terror gnawed at him. The same terror I felt as I stood before Laray's. I wanted to tell him to run, to burn this place down before it was too late. But my throat seized and only a wet, strangled wheeze escaped. He hesitated, as if he might say more, then turned abruptly and fled the room. Alone, I lay there, feeling the roots shift beneath my skin. I felt them probing deeper, coiling around my spine, brushing against memories like fingers flipping through old photographs. I saw Isabel again, her face flickering behind my eyes, her laughter echoing in my skull. But now it was distorted, stretched thin like a mask pulled too tight. I felt something else too. Beyond the walls of my room, beyond the sterile halls, I could sense them. The doctors, nurses, patients. I could feel their heartbeats like distant drums. I could taste their fear. A voice pulsed inside my head, deeper than thought, older than language. "Seed, spread, take root." A sudden violent spasm racked my body, my back arched, tendons straining against the restraints. I felt the roots surge forward, lancing up into my skull, splitting my memories into shards of light and darkness. When I collapsed back onto the bed, the world around me seemed sharper, clearer. The colors too vivid, the sounds too sharp, as if the world itself was breathing through my borrowed lungs. I looked at the door just as it creaked open. It was the archaeologist, the one who had first found me underground, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He took a tentative step inside, closing the door behind him. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, voice shaking. They said not to come, but I had to. I keep hearing your voice." I stared at him, my lips peeling back into something that might have once been a smile. His breath hitched, his hand pressed against his chest. "I don't know why, but since I touched you, I feel different. I hear things. I see her sometimes, your wife, Isabel. She calls to me." The sound of her name ripped through me like a blade. I wanted to scream, to claw her image out of his mind, but I was frozen. He staggered closer, falling to his knees beside my bed. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "Please," he begged, "make it stop, please." A tremor ran through my body. I felt the roots tighten, felt them hunger. The voice inside me roared, 1,000 tongues writhing in unison. "Feed." Without thinking, my hand shot forward, grasping his wrist. His skin was warm, alive, pulsing with terror. He screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The black veins pulsed brighter, crawling from my fingers into his arm, spiderwebbing up his shoulder, across his neck. His eyes rolled back, mouth hanging open in a silent scream as his body convulsed. In that moment I saw everything. His memories exploded behind my eyes like fireworks. His wife's smile, his daughter's tiny hands, his father's funeral, the smell of pine wood on his childhood porch. And then, it was gone. He slumped forward, eyes empty and unfocused. I let go, my own body shaking violently. A terrible cold spread through me, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But then I felt it, stronger now, the heartbeat that wasn't mine. A pulsing certainty, a hunger that swelled and spread. I realized in that hideous clarity that I wasn't just a vessel anymore. I was an opening, a door. I felt the roots inside me stir eagerly, stretching out like a network of veins beyond the room, beyond the hospital walls, whispering to every mind they could touch. I could feel them. People in nearby rooms, in the hallways, outside in the parking lot. Tiny tendrils probing their thoughts, slipping under their skin. And all of them heard the same voice. "Come home. We are waiting." I tilted my head back, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, I thought I heard Isabel again, singing somewhere far away, a lullaby twisted into something monstrous. A single tear slipped down my cheek. "I'm sorry," I mouthed, though I wasn't sure to whom. Her, the man crumpled on the floor, or the world beyond the walls. Then the scream began. First one voice, then two, then a chorus. Human voices, all screaming, echoing through the hospital corridors. The roots inside me pulsed with satisfaction. The harvest had begun. The scream that tore through the hospital was not human. It started as a single, high-pitched wail from down the hall, sharp, raw, like a soul being peeled from bone. But then it multiplied. Dozens of voices joined in, not in chorus, but in chaos, overlapping in a rising tide of agony and confusion. The lights flickered, machines beeped wildly, as if the building itself was panicking. From my bed, I watched it all unfold, frozen, not because I couldn't move, but because I didn't want to. The man I had touched, the archaeologist, lay slumped at the base of my hospital bed, his body still. But his mouth was open, and from deep in his throat came a soft clicking, like beetles crawling across glass. I looked down at my hands. The black roots had retracted slightly, almost shy now, but they pulsed with anticipation. Something inside me was awakening, not all at once, not like a switch. It was slower, more organic, a patient unraveling of humanity. The door burst open. 2 security officers stormed in, guns raised. Their eyes darted from the body on the floor to me. One shouted something, I think it was hands up, but it felt distant, hollow, like a memory echoing through fog. I lifted my hands, not in surrender, but in warning. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice, God. It didn't sound like mine anymore. It had a resonance now, layered and low, like a choir humming beneath my skin. The older guard hesitated. The younger one didn't. He charged, pushing his partner aside. He reached for me, maybe to restrain me, maybe to save me, but the moment his fingers brushed my forearm, I felt it happen again. The connection. Roots leapt from my skin to his, disappearing beneath his uniform like ink through paper. His eyes rolled back, his mouth dropped open in a silent scream, and then he collapsed. His partner backed away, gun trembling in his grip. "What the fuck are you?" he whispered. I stared at him, and I knew I could kill him if I wanted to. I could reach out, let the roots feed, let them take him whole. But I didn't. Instead, I turned my head to the side. Run. He bolted. I sat there, breathing heavily, watching his shadow disappear down the hallway. The room grew colder. From beyond the walls, I felt something stir. The roots I had planted, accidentally, instinctively, were growing, sliding through vents, into pipes, through wires and floorboards. They weren't physical in the traditional sense, not all of them. Some were mental, spiritual, a viral bloom of memory and hunger and invitation. I felt them touch minds. Some recoiled, some shattered, some opened, and through them I could see. Down the hall, a nurse stood in the middle of the corridor, blood running from her nose. She stared at nothing, mumbling a nursery rhyme to no one. In a nearby room, a young boy sat upright in bed, his eyes glowing faintly. He smiled as if remembering something beautiful, though tears streamed down his cheeks. Two orderlies were curled in the corner of a supply closet, arms around each other, whispering apologies they didn't understand. All of them were connected now, not controlled, not yet, but woven, threads in something ancient. I stood for the first time since the ritual. My knees wobbled, but I didn't fall. My body ached, but it obeyed. I stepped over the archaeologist's body, what was left of him, and walked barefoot down the hallway. The screams were fading now. In their place, I heard murmurs, whispers, pleas, songs. The hospital was changing. Vines bloomed across the walls, dark and slick with sap. Lights pulsed in strange rhythms, flickering not from failure but from emotion. The building was responding to something inside it. Me. I walked past the nurse's station. A man in a white coat sat slumped over the desk, his fingers stained with black ink. A spiral had been drawn across the floor. Something ancient, something ritualistic. He looked up at me, smiled, and said, "Welcome back, Father." I didn't correct him. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't an infection. It wasn't a possession. It was a blooming, a remembering. Something the world had buried deep beneath cathedrals and concrete and logic. But it had never died. It had only waited for a voice, for a vessel, for me. I stepped into the main lobby. A glass wall looked out over the pine forest. Outside, the sky was gray, swirling with clouds that pulsed like lungs. People had begun to gather. Doctors, nurses, patients, all of them standing in the parking lot, heads tilted to the sky, mouths open as if waiting for rain. They were humming, a low, unearthly sound that vibrated in the pit of my stomach. Behind me, more footsteps. I turned slowly. Elena Vargas stood there. Her black hair was streaked with gray now, her eyes tired but bright, roots coiled gently around her ankles like loyal pets. "You made your choice," she said softly. I nodded. "And now, the world will remember." She stepped forward and took my hand. No pain, no convulsion, just contact. "We held it back for centuries," she whispered. "We called it a curse, but it was never that. It was memory, sacred, older than language." Her voice trembled. "You weren't meant to hold it alone. We all must carry it now." I looked back at the glass, at the people standing outside like statues. The humming grew louder. I closed my eyes. Inside me, the roots pulsed. The heartbeat that wasn't mine beat once, then again. Not hunger this time, not possession. Awakening. The world had forgotten something, a truth too massive to live with, so it buried it in churches and monasteries and rituals no one understood anymore. But I remembered. And now, so would they. The humming outside rose to a fever pitch, vibrating through the walls and up into my bones. Elena's hand stayed in mine, warm and steady. Roots twisted gently up her wrist, coiling into mine like two rivers merging. We stood together in the shattered hospital lobby, framed by broken glass and swaying pines. Beyond the windows, the gathered crowd shifted. One by one, they stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like dancers in a silent procession. Their feet dragged along the asphalt, leaving smears of dark sap in their wake. I felt their thoughts, small, jagged things at first. Flashes of birthday cakes, first kisses, the warmth of a mother's embrace, tiny sparks of humanity clinging to life. But underneath, deeper, was something older, a shared pulse, a chorus waiting to be sung again after centuries of silence. Elena squeezed my hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "It's time to go, Noah." I looked at her, searching for any hint of hesitation, but her gaze was clear, luminous even, as though she had already accepted whatever lay beyond. "Where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded toward the glass doors. "Outside, to them, to the forest, to the world that forgot." The first of the crowd pressed against the broken glass, a woman in a hospital gown, her hair matted, eyes wide and glazed. Behind her, a nurse with dark circles under his eyes, his badge hanging sideways from his neck. Their mouths moved in unison, shaping silent words I could almost understand. Elena released my hand and stepped forward, placing her palm on the glass. It cracked beneath her touch, spiderweb fissures crawling out from her fingers. The humming shifted, higher, more urgent. I moved beside her, raising my own hand. The glass shattered outward in a single breathless instant, fragments sparkling in the morning light like falling stars. The crowd surged forward. Some fell to their knees as they crossed the threshold, hands pressed to the earth, sobbing or laughing. Others stumbled toward us, reaching out as if in prayer. I felt the roots in me stir eagerly, but I held them back. For now. Elena turned to face me, her eyes glistening with something like joy or relief. "They've waited so long," she whispered. "We kept it dormant, starved it, called it evil, but all it ever wanted was to return, to connect, to bloom again." I looked out at them, hundreds now, spilling from cars, hospital rooms, nearby streets. They moved together, not as individuals, but as a single wave of need. A man crawled forward, his hospital bracelet snapping against the pavement. He reached my feet and looked up, eyes shining. "Please," he rasped. "I'm so tired of being alone." Something inside me cracked, a dam breaking. I reached down, brushing my fingertips against his forehead. He gasped, a long, shuddering breath that ended in a blissful sigh. Black veins spidered out across his skin and he collapsed into my arms. I felt his memories flow into me. His mother's perfume, the girl he kissed behind the high school bleachers, his fear of dying alone. I took it all, folded it inside me, and gave him something in return: belonging. He stood, his eyes bright now, steady. He turned to the others and opened his arms wide. "We're not alone anymore," he cried. "We are one." A cry went up from the crowd, a joyous, ragged shout that rattled the treetops. I stepped forward, past the broken glass, past Elena. The roots beneath my skin pulsed like a second heartbeat, matching the crowd's energy. They parted for me, creating a narrow path that led down the parking lot, out into the street beyond. As I walked, they fell in line behind me, a procession. Some wept, some laughed. A few clawed at their own skin, tearing away old scars as if shedding a chrysalis. Elena walked at my side, her steps graceful, almost reverent. The roots from her feet merged with mine, trailing behind us like black silk ribbons. We moved together down the main road, past abandoned cars and toppled street signs. The fog rolled in from the tree line, curling around our feet like a curious animal. Above, the sky churned, thick clouds twisting and bulging as if something massive was pressing against them from the other side. Birds spiraled overhead in frantic patterns, their cries sharp and confused. The world seemed to hold its breath. I felt the weight of countless eyes on us, some physical, some distant, some hidden in dark rooms miles away, watching on screens or through half-drawn curtains. I watched as the curtains parted, and Cam and his head. Some would resist, some would flee, but they would all feel it, the invitation. The hum grew louder, rising to a fever pitch that rattled windows and set dogs howling in distant yards. I raised my arms, and the crowd behind me dropped to their knees in perfect synchronicity. Elena leaned in close, her lips brushing my ear. "It's time," she whispered. "Show them." I opened my mouth and exhaled. From my lungs poured a thick black mist, swirling and spiraling into the air like ink in water. It spread out, drifting toward the crowd, curling around each waiting face. They inhaled deeply, eagerly, their eyes rolling back as the roots took hold. I felt each new connection spark inside me, a lattice of minds and memories weaving into a single tapestry. With each breath, I grew stronger. My vision stretched outward, beyond the hospital, beyond the town, beyond the horizon. I could see others now, cities shimmering with potential, highways full of beating hearts waiting to be gathered. The world trembled at the edge of a new dawn, and I stood at its center. I looked down at my hands, at the black veins shimmering beneath the skin like midnight rivers. In that moment, I understood fully. I was no longer Noah Valdez, no longer a grieving husband, no longer a scholar dissecting the dead. I was the root, the seed, the bloom, the harbinger. We moved like a living artery through the town, me at the center, Elena beside me, and behind us 1,000 voices humming in fractured harmony. They came from every corner, from shattered windows and darkened doorways, from grocery stores where cans still lay scattered in aisles, from gas stations where pumps dripped and flickered under dead lights. I felt each new presence as they joined. Flickers of memories, old regrets, small joys, the taste of birthday cake, the heat of summer asphalt on bare feet, the ache of a first heartbreak. They rushed into me, crashing like waves on a broken shore, and each time I felt my own edges blur further. Somewhere behind all that noise, a small voice tried to hold on. My voice. Isabel. But it was fading. Elena turned to me, her eyes lit with a feverish glow, her face serene in the moonlight. "You see now, don't you?" she said, her voice low and reverent. "All of them, together, a single consciousness, no more loneliness, no more walls." I wanted to answer, but the words caught on something inside me, like roots twisting around a fallen tree. She stepped closer, her breath warm against my cheek. "We are the cure for this fractured world," she whispered. "They begged for connection, and now they have it. Through you." I opened my mouth, but instead of words, a low hum escaped, rich, resonant, inhuman. She smiled, touching my face with fingers that trembled with reverence. "You are beautiful," she said, tears glistening at the edges of her lashes. "We waited so long for you, Noah." The crowd surged forward again, pressing closer. Hands reached for me, touching my arms, my chest, my face. Each touch sent sparks through my skin, each spark stitching them tighter into the tapestry inside me. A man in a mechanic's uniform clutched my forearm, his eyes rolling back as he exhaled in relief. "I have to be alone anymore," he sobbed. A teenager with a shaved head pressed her forehead to my shoulder, her lips moving in a prayer I couldn't hear. An old woman with cataract blue eyes knelt at my feet, her gnarled hands wrapping around my ankle like a child clinging to a parent. I felt them all. I felt them become me, and through me I felt the earth shiver. Beneath the concrete and asphalt, the roots spread, tendrils sliding into soil, curling around ancient stones, splitting pipes, cracking foundations. The trees shuddered in the moonlight, their branches twisting as if reaching for something only they could see. Leaves turned black at the edges, curling inward in silent devotion. Somewhere far away, I felt water churn, a lake perhaps, or an underground river, fish scattering as dark filaments slipped between them like searching fingers. The world was opening. Alina stepped in front of me, lifting her arms, The moon caught in her eyes, turning them to silver pools. "This is the moment," she cried, her voice echoing across rooftops. "The return, the bloom, the great weaving of all souls." The crowd fell silent. The humming stopped. They knelt, a ripple of motion spreading outward like a stone thrown into water. I stood above them, swaying slightly, my breath shallow. I could feel my own heartbeat slowing, merging with that deeper, older pulse. My skin felt tight, as though it might split at any second and let the roots spill forth. Alina lowered her head and began to chant, low, rhythmic syllables that twisted the air around her. I recognized the language, though I didn't know how. The same language carved into the walls beneath Santa Leticia, the same tongue that had torn me open and filled me with this terrible, infinite life. As she chanted, black sap began to drip from her eyes, trailing down her cheeks like tears. The ground beneath us cracked open with a deep groan, a yawning fissure that glowed with a faint, pulsing light. I felt the urge to collapse into it, to finally let go and be consumed fully, to become nothing but the pulse, the song, the root. But then, a memory. A kitchen. Morning light. Isabel humming as she cut up mangoes, pausing every so often to smile at me with that sleepy warmth. The way she always danced a little, even when she thought no one was watching. "Live," she had whispered with her last breath. "Not connect, not merge, live." For a fleeting second, my mind cleared. A single, sharp breath rattled out of me. My fingers twitched, and I felt my knees buckle. Alina turned, sensing the shift. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice cracking with sudden fear. I looked at her, really looked, past the roots, past the chant, past the centuries of purpose. She was afraid. I realized then, even the root feared something. Choice. I fell to my knees, pressing my hands into the cracked asphalt. The roots inside me shivered, trying to pull me back up, but I resisted. Around me, the crowd began to murmur, their heads tilting in confusion. Alina stepped forward, frantic now. "Noah, you are the vessel. You can't stop this." But I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was listening to Isabel. Somewhere inside me, her voice echoed, steady and clear. "Live for me." I pressed my forehead to the ground. The roots howled inside me, a storm of rage and terror and need. My body seized, convulsed. A tearing sensation ripped through my spine. My eyes rolled back. The hymn started again, shaky, uncertain. Elena reached for me, fingers clawed and desperate. "No!" I looked up at her through tear-blurred eyes. "No," I whispered, my voice barely human. "I choose." I slammed my fists into the ground. The fissure glowed brighter, then flared into a searing white light. A scream rose from the crowd, a chorus of souls realizing too late that the connection was breaking. The roots recoiled, shrieking in my veins. I felt them ripping away pieces of me as they fled, trying to retreat into the earth. Elena staggered backward, her face twisting in horror. The black sap poured from her mouth as she choked on her own chant. I kept pressing, kept pushing, and in that final moment, before everything shattered, I felt Isabel's arms around me. Not the echo, not the monster, the real her, warm, gentle, alive. "Live," she said one last time, and then the world exploded into light. Silence. A silence so deep it rang in my ears like a church bell struck underwater. I didn't know how long I lay there, face pressed into the cracked asphalt, hands burned and bloodied from pounding the ground. My breaths came shallow, each inhale pulling in dust, each exhale tasting like rust. I felt empty. No, more than empty, hollowed out, as though something had scooped my insides with a jagged spoon and left nothing but echoes. I shifted, trying to push myself up, and felt a sharp pain slice through my ribs. My arms trembled under my weight. The ground was slick beneath me, streaked with black sap that was already drying into brittle, crusted lines. I forced my head up. The moon hung above, bright and unblinking, casting the whole street in a sterile, almost surgical glow. The crowd, the congregation that had followed me, was gone. All that remained were bodies. They lay sprawled in unnatural positions, arms twisted behind backs, necks bent at impossible angles. Their mouths were open, lips cracked and stained black. I looked around for Elena. I found her a few yards away, kneeling as if in prayer. Her hair hung in thick matted ropes around her face, her back hunched. Black sap poured from her eyes, nose, and mouth, pooling in a sticky lake beneath her. I crawled to her, each movement scraping my knees raw. When I reached her, I reached out a shaking hand and touched her shoulder. She jerked slightly at my touch, her head snapping up. Her eyes, once so bright and feverish, were sunken now, ringed with deep bruises. The black roots that had coiled around her skin were withering, breaking apart like burnt paper. She looked at me, her lips quivering. You don't understand," she gasped. Her voice was nothing but a hollow rattle, each word trembling on the edge of collapse. "It was supposed to be forever, to be unity. We would never be alone." I watched her struggle, a flicker of pity rising somewhere deep in my fractured heart. "I saw her," I whispered, my own voice hoarse and foreign. "I saw Isabel, the real her, and she told me to live." Elena shuddered, her body convulsing as if something inside her was breaking apart cell by cell. "You betrayed the bloom," she coughed, black sap bubbling from her throat. I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching hers. "I chose to be human." Her pupils dilated. For a fleeting moment, I saw something human flash through her eyes. Fear, grief, regret, before the light drained out completely. She fell forward into my arms, her last breath a ragged, gurgling sob. I held her there, feeling her weight grow heavier and colder with each second. When I finally lowered her to the ground, I collapsed beside her, my chest heaving. I don't know how long I lay there, minutes, hours, time lost all meaning. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up. The night air felt sharp against my skin, each breeze cutting into me like glass. I looked around again. Everywhere I turned, I saw loss. Empty eyes stared up at the sky, fingers clawed at the pavement, frozen mid-grasp. All those lives, all those stories, snuffed out because of me. I pressed my hand to my chest, expecting to feel the roots stirring. But there was nothing, just the slow, painful thud of my own heart. A sob ripped from my throat, loud and ugly, echoing off the abandoned buildings. I was alone again, truly alone. I crawled toward a crumpled figure near a tipped-over wheelchair. A young woman, barely 20, a small tattoo of a sunflower on her wrist. Her eyes still glistened faintly in the moonlight, locked forever in some final realization. I closed her eyes with shaking fingers. As I moved from body to body, I whispered a word for each. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry," over and over like a mantra until my voice cracked and faded to a broken rasp. When I finally staggered to my feet, I was dizzy, my vision tunneled and flickering. I looked at the moon one last time, imagining Isabel's face there, soft, forgiving. A single thought threaded through the chaos in my skull. I had ended it. I had cut the connection. But at what cost? I staggered down the street, past the bodies, past blackened tree roots curling and dying along the sidewalks. Each step felt like I was walking through water, my muscles screaming in protest. I didn't know where I was going. Some primal instinct dragged me forward, step by agonizing step, deeper into the silent town. The storefronts watched me with shattered windows for eyes. The neon signs buzzed weakly, flickering like fireflies on their last breath. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a small, empty chapel. The door hung open, creaking slightly in the wind. I stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the pale moonlight streaming through a cracked stained glass window. Wooden pews sat in neat rows, untouched, as though waiting for a congregation that would never arrive. At the front, a small altar, a simple wooden cross, a single unlit candle. I knelt, my knees hitting the cold stone floor. I pressed my forehead to the edge of the altar, tears streaming down my face, pooling on the worn wood. "Please," I croaked, not sure who I was speaking to. "God, Isabel, myself, please, forgive me. There was no answer. Only the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the empty nave. I stayed there, sobbing, until the moon slipped lower in the sky and the first light of dawn turned the horizon a soft, uncertain gray. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I heard my heart beat alone in my chest. And despite the ruin, despite the blood and the loss, there was one fragile thread that refused to snap. Life. I clung to it, trembling and broken, but alive. When the first rays of sun pierced the chapel window, I felt like they might burn me alive. I flinched, pressing my forehead deeper into the wooden altar, as though trying to burrow inside it. My skin prickled under the growing warmth. For the first time since Santa Leticia, I felt the sun not as a distant rumor, but as something real, something tangible, pressing against me. I forced myself to look up. The chapel felt impossibly empty. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of light. A moth battered itself weakly against the glass of the cracked window, its wings tattered and hopeless. I pushed myself to my feet, every joint crackling, every tendon taut as barbed wire. My palms slid against the altar as I steadied myself, leaving smears of blood and sweat. I turned, scanning the small space. Each creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet echoed like a gunshot. My legs carried me forward, each step slow and deliberate. I moved past the last row of pews and found a small table by the entrance, candles, a box of tithes, a chipped ceramic bowl filled with old, dried rose petals. I dipped my fingers into the bowl, rubbing the brittle petals between my thumb and forefinger. The smell rose faintly, ghosts of funerals, of wedding aisles, of vigil nights when desperate prayers burned holes in the dark. I took a petal and pressed it to my lips. It crumbled instantly, turning to dust. I felt something catch in my chest. I stumbled toward the door, shoving it open so hard it banged against the stone wall outside. The morning air rushed over me, sharp and cold. The sky was washed in pale gold, a few low clouds drifting lazily above the treetops. I stepped outside and nearly collapsed under the sudden rush of sound. Birds calling out from distant branches, a dog barking somewhere unseen, the wind rustling through dying leaves. I fell to my knees on the cracked pavement, hands pressed flat against the ground as if trying to feel the pulse of the world beneath me. And for the first time since the ritual, there was no echo, no humming chorus rising up from below, no whispered invitations coiling around my spine, just my heart, beating, alone. It was terrifying and beautiful. I tilted my head back, closing my eyes as sunlight spread across my face. A sob broke from my throat, half laughter, half grief. I stayed there until my arms gave out and I collapsed onto my side. The warmth of the asphalt seeped into my bones, and I let it. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard the first engine, a low rumble, hesitant, as though the driver wasn't sure they should continue. I forced myself up, squinting toward the curve in the road. A pickup truck rounded the corner slowly, tires crunching over debris. Its paint was sun-faded, a dent along the side like a scar. The truck rolled to a stop a few yards from me. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. A man, mid-40s maybe, wiry, with a sunburnt face and cautious eyes. He wore a battered baseball cap and a plaid shirt stained with oil and sweat. He froze when he saw me. I didn't blame him. I must have looked like a revenant, blood-stained, half-naked, hair matted, black sap still dried and cracked across my arms like old scars. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, voice trembling. He glanced back at the truck where a young girl peeked out the passenger window. Her eyes were wide, terrified. I lifted a hand slowly, palm open. I'm not going to hurt you," I managed, my voice a rasp that barely carried in the morning air. The man didn't move at first. Then, with infinite caution, he stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "What the hell happened here?" he asked. I laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that scraped my throat raw. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I whispered. He looked me up and down, his eyes catching on the blackened lines that crisscrossed my skin. Are you alone?" he asked. A lump rose in my throat. I swallowed hard, but it didn't go down. "Yeah," I finally said. "I'm alone." He glanced back at the girl again, then back at me. "You need help? A doctor? Police?" I shook my head, a wild, shaky gesture that made me dizzy. "No police," I said quickly, too quickly. "No doctors. Please. Just water, please." He hesitated, then turned and jogged back to the truck. A moment later, he returned with a battered plastic bottle. I grabbed it with both hands, nearly dropping it in my desperation. I twisted the cap off and poured it into my mouth. Water splashed down my chin and onto my chest, but I didn't care. I drank until the bottle was empty, then dropped it and fell forward, coughing. "Thank you," I gasped. "God, thank you." The man stood there, shifting from foot to foot, clearly unsure what to do next. Finally, he crouched beside me, his voice lower now. "What's your name?" he asked. I opened my mouth. The answer rose automatically out of old habit, old self, but it didn't feel right anymore. I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my lids, I saw her, Isabel, standing on that sunlit porch, smiling at me with a quiet strength. I took a long, shaky breath. "Noah," I said finally, the word tasting like smoke and honey all at once. "My name is Noah." The man nodded slowly, as though tasting the name himself. "Okay, Noah," he said. "My name's Ray. That's my daughter June. We can take you somewhere safe, get you cleaned up, figure this out." Safe. The word felt foreign, heavy, impossible, but also necessary. I nodded, though my head felt like it might split open from the simple motion. Ray stood, then reached down, offering his hand. For a moment, I hesitated, terrified that if I touched him, the roots would leap from me again, that the darkness would spread and devour him and his daughter, just as it had devoured everything else. But nothing stirred beneath my skin. No whispers, no hunger. I reached up and took his hand. His grip was strong and human and warm. And for the first time in what felt like centuries, I let someone pull me up. Ray's hand felt like an anchor, dragging me out of the abyss one trembling inch at a time. I rose to my feet on legs that felt like hollow reeds. My knees buckled and I nearly collapsed again, but Ray caught me with surprising strength. "Easy, brother," he murmured, looping an arm under my shoulders. His breath smelled like coffee and stale cigarettes. It was the most alive thing I'd inhaled in what felt like a lifetime. We staggered toward the truck together, each step a small battle. I could feel the morning sun on my back, sharp and almost too bright. As we reached the passenger side, the little girl inside shrank back, her huge eyes fixed on me with terror. "June, sweetheart," Ray said softly, tapping the window. "Unlock the door." She hesitated, fingers trembling on the handle. Her gaze flicked from her father to me, her mouth pressed into a tight, pale line. "June," he said again, firmer this time. "It's okay, he needs our help." With a reluctant shudder, she popped the lock. Ray opened the door and helped me inside. The vinyl seat stuck to my skin, every movement scraping against old blood and dried sap. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes as Ray rounded the truck and climbed into the driver's side. For a moment, there was only the rhythmic click of June's shallow breaths and the quiet creak of the truck's suspension as Ray settled into his seat. I cracked an eye open and met June's stare. "Hi," I managed, my voice a dry rasp that felt like sandpaper on my tongue. She didn't answer. Instead, she hugged her knees to her chest and turned her face to the window, as if hoping to disappear into the passing trees. I didn't blame her. Ray turned the key. The engine shuddered to life, coughing once before settling into a low rumble. He looked at me, his expression torn between compassion and caution. "You okay back there?" he asked. I nodded, though the motion sent a sharp bolt of pain through my neck. Ray shifted into gear and the truck rolled forward, bumping over broken asphalt and weaving around abandoned cars and tree branches. As we crept through the empty town, I saw what was left behind. Bodies slumped over steering wheels, doors hanging open, shopping carts tipped over in the middle of intersections. A dog stood in the middle of the street, head cocked, watching us with a low growl vibrating in its chest. The deeper we drove, the more silent it became. It wasn't just that the people were gone. It was as though the town itself had exhaled its last breath. Ray kept one hand on the wheel, the other drumming restlessly on his thigh. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking on me. "So? Noah, was it?" he said finally. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like it was packed with broken glass. "Yeah," I croaked. "Noah." He nodded, his jaw flexing as he considered his next question. "You from around here?" I let out a weak, humorless laugh that scraped at the back of my teeth. "No," I said, "not anymore." Silence settled between us like a thick fog. After a few minutes, he tried again. "You got family? Someone we can call?" Isabel's face flashed behind my eyes. Her bright laugh, the warmth of her hands, the quiet way she used to say my name when no one else was listening. A deep ache clawed at my chest, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "No," I said again, softer this time. "No one." Ray's fingers tightened on the wheel. He didn't push further. We drove past the town limits. A faded green sign read, "Thank you for visiting Clearhaven," in cheery letters that felt almost mocking now. As we rolled under it, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I felt the roots inside me truly silent. No whispers, no hunger, only a heavy, empty space echoing where they used to writhe. I glanced at June. She was still curled into herself, her forehead pressed against the glass. Her small shoulders trembled with each shaky breath. She doesn't have to be afraid of me," I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Ray shot me a wary glance, his eyes dark. "She's been through a lot," he said carefully. "We all have. Seeing you like that, you can't blame her for being scared." I nodded, my chin dropping to my chest. "I know," I whispered. "I know." Ray slowed the truck as we turned onto a narrow dirt road flanked by towering pines. Sunlight filtered through the branches in wavering beams, dancing across the windshield. At the end of the road, a small cabin sat nestled among the trees, smoke curling weakly from a tin chimney. Ray pulled up beside it and cut the engine. "We'll lay low here," he said, "at least until we figure out what's going on." I stared at the cabin, the word safe echoing in my head like a bad joke. Ray stepped out and opened my door. He reached for me again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took his hand, let him help me out of the truck. My feet hit the dirt and the smell of pine and earth rushed into my nose, almost enough to make me collapse again. June scrambled out of the other side and ran for the cabin, her small figure vanishing inside before the screen door slapped shut behind her. Ray and I stood there for a moment, the quiet stretching between us like a rope frayed at both ends. Finally, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Come on," he said, "let's get you inside." I took one last look at the trees, at the endless sky above, at the empty road behind us, and then I followed him into the cabin, the door creaking shut behind me like the final chord of a requiem. The cabin smelled of pine resin and old coffee grounds. I stepped inside slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, filtering through threadbare curtains. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams of morning sun, each one glinting like a tiny star. June sat at the kitchen table, knees drawn up to her chest, hugging them tightly. She stared at me as I crossed the threshold, her eyes huge and unblinking, like a deer frozen on the edge of a highway. Ray moved past me, filling a dented kettle at the sink. The faucet let out a metallic groan before sputtering a thin stream of water. "You should sit down," he said without turning around. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a strain he was trying hard to bury. I looked around. A wooden chair stood next to the table, its paint chipped and peeling. I shuffled toward it, each step dragging. My body felt like a borrowed shell, every joint stiff and foreign. When I sat, the chair creaked under my weight, a long sigh of protest that felt oddly alive. Ray set the kettle on a small gas stove and lit it with a click and a burst of blue flame. June shifted in her seat, her gaze flicking from me to her father and back again. Her knuckles were white where they clutched her knees. "She doesn't talk much anymore," Ray said suddenly, his back still to us. "Not since..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Well, she'll come around. She's tough. The kettle began to hiss softly, steam curling toward the ceiling. I wanted to speak, to say something comforting, something human, but my mind was a barren field. Every word felt distant, echoing off empty walls inside me. After a moment, June pushed her chair back with a squeal and fled down a short hallway. A door slammed softly. Ray flinched at the sound, his shoulders slumping. He turned around, eyes landing on me. "You want to tell me what the hell happened out there?" he asked, voice low. I looked at my hands resting on the table. The black veins were gone now, replaced by faint scars that twisted like charred vines under my skin. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. "I don't know how to start," I rasped. "Start anywhere," he said. "We've got time." The kettle shrieked. Ray turned, poured water into 2 chipped mugs, dropped instant coffee crystals inside. He carried one to me, setting it on the table before dropping into the chair across from me. The steam fogged my vision and I curled my fingers around the mug, savoring the heat seeping into my bones. I took a shaky breath. There was something buried, I began, my voice cracking on the words. Something ancient. Under Santa Leticia. Under all of us, really. Ray didn't move, didn't blink. "It's not just a monster," I continued. "It's a hunger, a need to connect, to bind everything together into one mind, one voice." It offered comfort, a false unity, but at a price. I squeezed the mug tighter. It almost took me. I almost let it. But then I closed my eyes. Isabel's face bloomed behind my lids, soft and radiant, her lips shaping the word that had saved me. Live. "But then I chose to stay human," I whispered, "and when I did, everything fell apart." Ray leaned back, his fingers drumming on the side of his mug. "Those people in the town, they're dead because of you," he said finally, his voice tight. The words hit me like a hammer. I flinched, my chest caving in on itself. "I know," I croaked. "I know, and I'll carry that until I die." Ray's jaw flexed. He looked down at his coffee, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "And us?" he asked. "Why didn't it take us too?" I swallowed. "Because I ended the connection before it reached you. Before it could spread further, you were just outside the radius. Lucky." He let out a shaky laugh that turned into a choked sob. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, as though angry at himself for breaking. A heavy silence settled over us, thick as wet cement. After a long moment, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He paced to the window, staring out at the sunlit clearing beyond the pines. "I don't know what the hell to do with you," he said without turning. "I don't know if I should help you, kill you, or just leave you here to rot." I nodded, the motion small and exhausted. "Do what you need to do," I said. "I'm done running." Ray turned back to me, his face a battlefield of grief and rage and confusion. "You don't look like a monster," he said. "But, God help me, I can't tell if that's a blessing or a curse." I looked up at him, my own eyes hollow. "Neither can I said. Outside the wind shifted, rattling the thin window panes. Birds called out in the distance, sharp, uncertain cries that echoed through the clearing. Ray opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Finally, he turned and walked down the hallway toward June's room. I heard a door open softly, hushed voices rising and falling like waves on a dark shore. I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead to the warm ceramic of the mug. For the first time in days, I felt no chorus. No roots twisting in my vein, just the distant thud of my heart and the faint sound of a father trying to comfort his daughter in the next room. A single tear slid down my cheek, splashed into the mug, and vanished into the bitter coffee below. I sat there, unmoving, as the sun climbed higher and the morning light washed over me like a silent absolution. I don't know how long I sat there at that kitchen table, forehead pressed against the rim of the mug. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second stretching into hours, each breath scraping the inside of my lungs like sandpaper. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb, turning the clearing beyond the cabin into a mosaic of light and shadow. The wind rustled the pines, and every so often a bird shrieked, sharp and sudden like a warning shot. Ray's low voice drifted from the hallway, words muffled, wrapped in the soft tremor of a father trying to hold his world together. June's smaller, shaking replies came in waves, hiccuping sobs that sliced straight through me. I tried not to listen, but it seeped into me anyway. I had become a vessel for other people's fears, other people's memories. Even now, emptied and severed from that monstrous hive, I still felt everything as if my skin had been peeled away. I pushed myself back from the table. The chair shrieked across the floor, echoing in the quiet cabin. My knees buckled and I caught myself against the counter. I needed to move. Somewhere deep inside, an instinct tugged at me, an animal urge to flee, to run into the trees and vanish. But that was the old instinct, the one that had led me into Santa Leticia's depths, into that confessional, into the waiting arms of something older than death. I had followed that instinct before. It had led me to ruin. Not this time. I shuffled toward the small hallway, one hand trailing along the rough wood paneling. The floorboards creaked under my weight. At the end of the hall, a door hung ajar. I paused. Inside, Ray sat on the edge of the bed, head bowed, one big hand resting on June's shoulder. Her small form was curled into herself, face buried in the blanket. Ray looked up, eyes bloodshot, his expression hard to read. 1,000 emotions flickered there. Fear, anger, gratitude, grief. I stood in the doorway, my lips parting, but no words came. Ray held my gaze for a long, silent moment. Then he turned back to June, smoothing her hair back gently. "It's okay, baby," he murmured. "I'm right here. We're okay." June peeked over her shoulder at me, her eyes swollen and red. She didn't flinch this time. She just watched, studied me. I tried to smile, but the movement felt alien on my face. Finally, I turned away, drifting back down the hall like a ghost. I moved to the front door and opened it. A blast of cold air met me, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I stepped out onto the small porch, the boards groaning beneath me. The clearing was bathed in golden light now, shafts of sun slicing through the mist rising from the forest floor. For a moment, it was beautiful enough to take my breath away. I stepped down onto the dirt, my bare feet sinking into the cool, soft soil. Every step felt like I was waking up from a coma. I moved past the edge of the clearing, deeper into the trees. The forest closed around me, the canopy swallowing the sun in shifting patches. I found a moss-covered stump and sat heavily. I pressed my hands together, feeling the faint pulse of my own blood beneath the skin. My fingers trembled as I laced them tight, squeezing until my knuckles blanched. My mind drifted. I saw Isabel standing on the porch of our old house, hair pulled back, paint splattered across her forearms from a half-finished mural in the kitchen. She turned toward me, eyes crinkling at the edges, her laugh dancing in the air. "Dieu mi amour," she had called me then. "You look like you've seen a ghost." And I had. Even then, before Santa Letitia, before the roots, before the chorus of endless hungry voices, I had been haunted. Haunted by the knowledge that one day I would lose her. Haunted by the certainty that life is a constant act of letting go. A sharp breath hitched in my throat, and my chest tightened painfully. I closed my eyes. "Isabel," I whispered into the stillness. "I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if I'm praying or just talking to an echo. But I chose to live. You were right." The wind shifted, rustling the branches above me. A pine cone dropped somewhere nearby, thudding into the undergrowth. For a moment, I let myself imagine that it was her reply. I opened my eyes and let the forest come back into focus. The sway of ferns, the hush of needles falling, the distant drip of water. In the distance, I heard the cabin door creak open. I turned. Ray stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching me. He didn't shout, didn't call me back, he just stood there, a silent sentinel. After a few minutes, he stepped down and approached, his boots crunching on the forest floor. He stopped a few feet away. "You gonna run?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I've done enough running." He nodded, slowly, as though testing the words against some private measure. "You're not like them," he said finally. "Not anymore. You're..." Something else now. I laughed, a dry, ragged sound. I don't even know what I am anymore, I admitted. Ray stepped closer, his gaze steady. Maybe you don't have to know today, he said. Maybe you just take the next step, then the next. I looked down at my hands, scarred and trembling. One step at a time, I echoed, the words heavy on my tongue. Ray offered his hand again. I hesitated, then I took it. His grip was firm, grounding, warm. Together we turned back toward the cabin. The rising sun filtered through the trees, catching the edges of the clearing in molten gold. For the first time in what felt like centuries, I felt something close to hope, something fragile, flickering, but alive. Ray's hand didn't let go of mine until we reached the porch. Even then, his fingers hovered at my elbow, as if he was afraid I might dissolve into mist and slip back into the woods. June watched us through the screen door, her small hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly her knuckles glowed white. Her eyes flicked from me to her father and back again, her breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts. When we stepped inside, the cabin seemed to exhale, as though the walls themselves had been holding a tense breath. Ray moved toward the stove, busying himself with the kettle again. The scent of burned coffee grounds still clung to the air like a phantom. I hovered near the door, my hand resting lightly on the knob. My fingers itched to turn it, to step back outside and keep walking until the forest swallowed me whole. June slid out from behind the screen and approached, cautiously, each step a careful question. She stopped a few feet away, her wide brown eyes locked on mine. "You're not gonna hurt us, are you?" she asked. Her voice was small, fragile as an eggshell. The question hit me harder than any blade. I dropped my gaze to the floor, my throat closed up, a heavy knot forming just below my Adam's apple. "No," I rasped. "No, I'm not." She studied me, her thin shoulders rising and falling with each careful breath. Finally, she nodded, just once, then turned and scurried to the far side of the room. She settled into a worn armchair, curling into herself like a cat seeking warmth. Ray turned, mugs in hand. He set one in front of me, steam curling up in soft spirals. "Sit," he said. I obeyed, the old wooden chair groaning under my weight. I wrapped my hands around the mug, savoring the heat that seeped into my skin. We sat in silence. The only sounds were the faint hiss of the stove cooling and June's shallow breathing across the room. After a long moment, Ray leaned forward, his elbows resting on the scarred table. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. I stared into the swirling steam, searching for an answer in those fleeting wisps. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I don't know who I am now, or what I'm supposed to be." Ray's gaze was heavy, but not unkind. "You're still breathing," he said. "That's a start." I looked up sharply, a bark of bitter laughter escaping my lips. "That's not enough," I said, shaking my head. "Breathing isn't living, not really." Ray nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the tabletop. "Then figure it out," he said. "Figure out what living means to you. And if you need a place to do that, you can stay here, at least for a while." His words hit me like a tidal wave. Stay. The idea felt impossible, foreign. A word meant for other people, people who hadn't been hollowed out and twisted by something older than death. "Why?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Why would you let me stay?" Ray's eyes flicked to June, who had fallen half asleep in the chair, her knees tucked under her chin. "Because she needs to see that the world isn't just monsters," he said. "Because I need to believe that too." My lips parted, but no words came. I turned in my seat, staring at June as her eyelids fluttered and she shifted deeper into the chair's worn cushions. Somewhere deep in the forest of my mind, a memory rose. Isabel's hands cradling a clay pot on the porch, her fingers stained with soil, a small green shoot poking through. She had looked up at me then, eyes shining. "You don't just plant something and walk away," she had said. "You stay, you water it, you watch it grow." A tremor passed through me, from my scalp to my heels. "Stay." I closed my eyes, forcing back the rising swell of grief that threatened to choke me. When I opened them again, Ray was still watching me, waiting. I let out a long, shuddering breath. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll stay. For now." Ray nodded once, as if sealing a quiet contract. He stood and moved toward June, draping a blanket over her small, curled form. I watched him, the simplicity of his gesture like a punch to the gut. He turned back to me, his mouth opening as if to say something more. But then he simply nodded again and stepped into the kitchen. I stayed at the table, my fingers tracing the chipped rim of the mug. The warmth seeped into my bones, spreading slowly, like light touching the corners of a long-abandoned room. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if the roots would stay gone, or if some dark echo would rise again in the night. But in that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't dared to name in a long time: possibility. June stirred under the blanket, her face softening in sleep. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath a small miracle. I placed a trembling hand over my own heart. It beat slow and heavy, alone in my chest. For the first time, I let myself feel it. Really feel it. Alive. I closed my eyes, inhaled the scent of pine and old wood, and let that single word echo through the hollow spaces inside me. Alive. That night, the cabin held a silence so heavy it felt like a living thing. June had finally drifted into a deep, unbroken sleep, her tiny breaths a fragile metronome in the dark. Ray sat in the armchair, a shotgun across his lap, head tilted back, eyes closed but not truly resting. I sat alone at the kitchen table. A single candle flickered in front of me, its light carving deep shadows into the lines of my face. Each tiny movement of the flame sent distorted shapes crawling across the walls, like ghostly dancers in a room that wasn't meant for them. I turned my hands over in the candlelight. The scars, the faint black lines, the reminders of what I had been, what I had almost become, stood out like roadmaps to a place I never wanted to revisit. I pressed my palms together, the motion instinctive, almost a prayer. But I wasn't praying. Not to God, not to Isabel, not to anything that might be listening. I was confessing to myself. I closed my eyes and the images came as they always did. Isabel laughing in the sun, paintbrush in hand, a streak of blue across her cheek, her soft voice whispering, "Live, mi amor." The moment her eyes went blank, her hand going slack in mine. Then the faces in the town, each soul pulled into the web I had carried inside me, each life snuffed out in the name of unity, swallowed by that ancient hungry root, their final screams curled around my bones like smoke. A shudder racked through me, and my forehead fell to the table with a dull thud. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale a stuttering apology. "I'm sorry," I croaked. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know." My fingers clawed at the wood, splinters biting under my nails. The candle flickered violently, as if protesting my words. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jerked up, eyes wide, expecting Ray, but it was no one. Just the empty kitchen. The dark. The candle's quivering flame. My chest heaved as I realized the truth. I would never stop seeing them. Never stop hearing them. I had chosen to live, but life came with a price. To carry the weight of what I had done, to bear the echoes of all those souls, their unfinished stories vibrating in the hollow places of my heart. A part of me wanted to run back into the forest, bury myself in dirt until the roots found me again and dragged me back into that warm, terrible unity. But I stayed. That was the choice. To stay, to keep breathing, to feel the pain, to keep remembering. Slowly I pushed myself up from the table. My legs trembled, but they held. I moved toward the small bathroom down the hall. I flicked the light on. The mirror was cracked, a jagged spiderweb running through the center. My reflection stared back at me, warped and broken. I studied my face, the sunken eyes, the hollowed cheeks, the constellation of scars. I reached up and traced the black lines that still ghosted under my skin. I pressed my fingertips into them, waiting for the familiar hum, the hunger. Nothing came, only me. I let out a shaky breath and leaned forward until my forehead touched the cold glass. My reflection blurred, and for a moment, I imagined Isabel standing behind me, her gentle hands resting on my shoulders, her voice warm and quiet. "You did it," she would say. "You came back." But when I looked up, she wasn't there, only me. Broken, haunted, alive. I turned off the light and stepped back into the hallway. Ray stood there now, watching me. His eyes searched mine, deep and cautious. The shotgun still hung at his side, but his grip had softened. "You okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I nodded, a jerky, uneven motion. "No," I whispered, "but I will be." He studied me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Good enough," he said. We stood in the hallway together, two men tangled in grief, each carrying ghosts neither of us could name. Then, from the living room, June's voice cut through the quiet. "Is it gone?" she called, small and uncertain. Ray turned, his face softening. "Yeah, baby," he said. "It's gone." I stepped forward, my feet heavy on the wooden floor. June peeked out from the blanket, her eyes wide and searching. When she saw me, she didn't flinch this time. Instead, she held out her tiny hand. My heart twisted in my chest. I felt the echo of old fear, the instinct to recoil, to run, but I forced myself forward. I knelt in front of her, took her hand in mine. It was warm and fragile, her fingers wrapping around mine with surprising strength. She studied me, her head tilted slightly. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Yeah," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm going to stay." She nodded once, a small, solemn gesture, then slipped her hand from mine and tucked it under her blanket again. I stayed kneeling there for a long moment, listening to her breathing slow, her eyes flutter shut. Ray stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. I looked up at him, my vision swimming. "Don't thank me," I said. "Just help me remember why it's worth it." He nodded, his hand squeezing gently. Together, we stood in the quiet living room, the first light of dawn bleeding into the sky outside. A new day, a new choice. I wasn't a savior. I wasn't a monster. I was just a man. A man trying, moment by moment, to be more than the worst thing he had ever done, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Thank you for walking with me through this story. Thank you for holding your breath with every twist, for listening to every broken confession, and for keeping your heart open even in the darkest moments. Stories like this one aren't just about monsters hiding in the shadows or roots twisting under the earth. They're about the monsters we carry inside ourselves. The grief, the guilt, the hunger for connection, the desperate need to belong. In the end, Noah's story isn't about defeat or victory. It's about choosing to live even when it hurts, about staying even when every part of you wants to run. If you're here, still listening, still breathing with me, I hope you remember this. No matter how lost or broken you feel, there's always a choice, a chance to be human, a chance to stay. Thank you for giving your time, your mind, and your heart to this story. It means more than you know. If you felt something, a shiver down your spine, a lump in your throat, or a flicker of hope, please consider sharing this story with someone else who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to join me for more journeys into the dark corners of the human soul, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know what spoke to you most. Until next time, stay safe, stay human, and keep choosing to live. Good night.